want to thank you for joining us for the December GATE Equity webinar on Hope Science. The PowerPoint is posted on the OSPI GATE Equity webinar page. My name is Bonnie Zimmerman. I'm a program specialist at OSPI, and today's topic is Hope 201, an intro to the science and theory of hope. We chose this topic because we want to share the research and science on how you can create meaningful pathways for the youth in your community. Our learning objectives are to learn about Washington Healthy Youth Survey data on the Hope Scale, learn about the science and theory of hope, learn how you build a school of hope. We're looking at a 3-year pilot, and what you can do to nurture hope in high trauma youth. My name is Bonnie Zimmerman. I'm joined today by Emily Maughan, who is our Healthy Youth Survey and Life Skills Program Supervisor, and Chan Hellman, who is a professor at the Ann and Henry Zero School of Social Work at the University of Oklahoma. At OSPI, we envision all students prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. OSPI developed an equity statement that we think helps frame our webinars. We believe each student, family, and community possesses strengths and cultural knowledge that benefit their peers, educators, and schools. This webinar is brought to you by the Office of System and School Improvement. Next month, we're going to be talking about college readiness and master scheduling. You can register for those webinars now. I think we'll have the links in the chat for you. We have a sister webinar series. It's the MTSS PLC webinar series. They have a great lineup of presenters and topics. This webinar would be useful for any school that wants to think more deeply about MTSS implementation. Emily, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So psychologist Rick Snyder once said, if a miracle happened and you could have your life be exactly the way you wanted, what would it be like? Your journey to higher hope begins with an honest appraisal of who you are, how you think about your life, what you want for yourself, and how you can get what you want. Dr. Snyder, who was a professor at the University of Kansas, went on to create the Children's Hope Scale, a scale that has been used nationally to measure hope. This 6-question assessment is a tool that can help measure hope in individuals ages 8 to 16. The scale asks 3 questions about pathways, a child's belief in their capacity to find multiple ways to reach their goal, and 3 questions about agency, which is a child's self-efficacy and motivation to use multiple ways to reach their goal. As you can see here, the Children's Hope Scale is displayed on the screen. So the 3 agency questions are, I think I am doing pretty well. I am doing just as well as the other kids my age. I think the things that I have done in the past will help me in the future. And the pathway questions are, I can think of many ways to get the things in my life that are most important to me. When I have a problem, I can come up with lots of ways to solve it. Even when others want to quit, I know that I can find ways to solve the problem. So children rate these questions on a scale of 1 to 6, 1 being none of the time, and 6 being all the time. The results are then added up to create a total hope score. Scores range from 6 to 36, and the higher the score, the more hopeful a child is considered to be. In 2018, 4 questions from the Children's Hope Scale were asked on the Healthy Youth Survey to students in 8th to 12th grade. 4 rather than 6 questions were asked due to spacing, but researchers noted that just asking 4 questions still made the scale valid. 2 questions were asked about pathways and 2 questions were asked about agency. Overall hope scores were then calculated, and students whose total scores were 4 to 8 indicated to have no or very low hope, 9 to 12 indicated slightly hopeful, 13 to 16 indicated moderately hopeful, and 17 to 24 indicated highly hopeful. In the state sample report of the Healthy Youth Survey, it was found that 1 out of 2 students across all 3 grades were considered highly hopeful. When we look at students who were considered highly hopeful versus those whose scores showed that they had no or very low hope, and cross-reference that with questions on the Healthy Youth Survey that ask students if there are people at school who will help them if they need it, you'll see that the results are drastically different, with over 55% of students who are considered highly hopeful stating there are people who can help them if they need it at school, and less than 5% of students who had no or very low hope stating that there are people who can help them if they need it. Other questions can be cross-referenced with the questions regarding the hope scale, and Chan will show some of these in his presentation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chan. So Chan is a professor at the Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work and founding director of the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma. Chan holds adjunct professor appointments in the Department of Internal Medicine and Department of Pediatrics from the OU College of Medicine and Department of Health Promotion Science for the OU College of Public Health. He has written more than 150 scientific publications and has presented at numerous national and international conferences worldwide. Chan's research is focused on hope as a psychological strength, helping children and adults overcome trauma and adversity.
Thank you for the introduction. And it's great, at least virtually, to be back in the great state of Washington. I'm a quantitative psychologist by training, and I've been studying hope for about 11 years. I would say the first 7 years of our work on hope has been building the science of hope, especially in the context of trauma and adversity. And the last 3 years, we've been fairly focused on looking at strategies to nurture hope, and especially on how to sustain hope, again, primarily in the focus of trauma-exposed children and adults. I'm the founding director of the Hope Research Center. Previously, that was the Center of Applied Research for Nonprofit Organizations. Our center works with schools and human service organizations to both integrate hope as well as to measure the impact of those initiatives and focus on, especially, again, moving from no hope or low hope to moderate to higher hope. So when we think about what hope is, we have to think about whether or not it is an emotion or a cognition. I tend to focus on hope as a cognition, and the importance of that is because hope can be learned or taught. And we actually think that emotion is an outcome of hope. So our definition of hope is belief that the future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. Now, the first part of this definition, hope is the belief that your future will be better, is optimism. It's the last half of the definition that distinguishes hope in that you have the power to make it so. So hope is about taking action to pursue your future. What I really love about hope is its simplicity. I can tell you that as an academic, jokingly, I was trained, why write something in 5 words when I can use 500 words? Typically, the more complex those ideas are, the better. But the thing that I really enjoy about hope is its simplicity. And so hope is about 3 primary issues. The first is that each and every one of us, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, are setting goals and pursuing goals in our life. So goals are really the cornerstone of hope theory. In order to be considered hopeful, you have to have both pathways and willpower. Now, the correct term is actually agency. I prefer to use the word willpower, mainly because when I work with organizations, it allows us to distinguish when we say the word agency, whether or not we're talking about willpower or the organization. So pathways are really the roadmaps or the strategies that we have to pursue our goals. And it also includes our capacity for problem solving when we experience obstacles. Willpower is really the mental energy that we have in order to pursue these pathways. Willpower is really things like motivation, commitment, self-control, perseverance, self-efficacy, optimism. Those are the components of hope. Now, what I've really been interested in for the past couple of years is to really distinguish between higher hope children and lower hope children. In particular, what we've learned is that both high hope and low hope children set goals. They have pathways and have willpower. It's the nature of those that are really starting to distinguish these youth. So for instance, one of the things that we've learned is that higher hope individuals are more likely to set achievement goals. Lower hope youth are more likely to set avoidance goals. Now, let me give you an example of that. I was homeless throughout high school, from 7th grade throughout my 12th grade graduating high school. And when I graduated high school, the principal asked us to state what we were going to do for the future. And for me, as a homeless youth, my goals had been focused on where I was going to eat, where I was going to sleep, and how I was going to be safe. And in particular, school was my safe place for those. And I realized that I was going to lose that capacity. So I started to think about what my future could look like. And I realized that I could work on a farm, I could work at a prison, I could join the military, or I could go to college. I chose going to college not to get a college degree, but rather to avoid the other options. And so as a result, my first semester grade point average was a 0.56. So what I want to highlight is that the nature of the goals we set dictates the way we think about pathways. So for me, going to class was not a pathway to the goal that I desired. At that time, I was focused on avoiding the other option. A few years later, when I took a psychology course for the first time, I started to realize what I wanted to do, and my goal changed from avoidance to achievement. And suddenly, all of the classes that I was enrolled in, general education, humanities, and others, became pathways to the goals that I set. So I began to reconsider the role that school played in my life. And of course, my grade point average increased dramatically. We've also learned that lower hope children tend to struggle with the planning piece in terms of identifying pathways and problem solving. A final thing I'll mention and go back to goals is that what we've learned is that high trauma youth are especially focused on goals that are about 24 to 48 hours out, that asking them to think about and focus on long-term goals becomes much more difficult for them. The final thing I'll say is with regards to willpower. For all of us, willpower is limited, is finite at any given day. We only have so much mental energy to dedicate towards our pathways. And the research is showing that willpower is associated with the glucose in our blood. And as you know, glucose for us is energy. And when we deplete that energy, we're less likely to be able to maintain self-control. So that's what we've been fairly focused on in our research over the last couple of years. So again, the primary aspects of hope are centered around the goals that we desired. I think it's important here to also highlight that when we're working with youth, that we have to remember it's their goals, not our goals for them. It's something that they desire. And so in order to be considered hopeful, you have to have both willpower and way power. For instance, if I'm highly motivated for some goal that I value, but I don't know how to get there from here, I would be considered lower in hope. Alternatively, if I have pathways available to me, but I'm not interested or motivated to do that work, then again, I would be considered lower in hope. So for instance, if there were pathways available to me to help me improve my grades, like working with a tutor or studying, but I wasn't motivated to do those things, then I would be considered lower in hope, as I mentioned. Usually at this point, I like for us to consider the differences or the primary aspects about hope, and for each of you to consider for a moment how often you use that word and in what context. So think about how often you use the word every day, and think about the ways in which you use that. For instance, for me in Oklahoma, it's about 40 degrees outside, and I'm hopeful that it doesn't rain tomorrow. I may run across a colleague and say, I hope you have a great day, or I hope that you are well. And given this new idea of goals, pathway, and willpower, we start to realize that we oftentimes use the word hope incorrectly. And in fact, it's important for us to distinguish between hope and a wish. So wish is when we have high motivation for an outcome, but we don't have the pathways to get there from here. So for instance, I have no control over the rain, and so it would be better for me to say, I wish it wouldn't rain. My final comment here is that hope is about action. It's about taking action to pursue the goals that you desire. Now, there are a little over 2,000 published studies on hope in the way that we're talking about it today. And I'm going to stay pretty focused on hope in the context of youth and education. Please know that there's a vast literature in medicine, in mental health, in criminology, as well as the workplace. So in education, what the research is telling us and what some of our studies are showing is that when children have increased hope scores, they have better daily attendance at school. They have better grades. There's fewer referrals to discipline issues, as well as higher levels of engagement. Youth with higher hope scores have higher graduation rates and higher college going rates as well. There's about 5 or 6 published studies now that are demonstrating that hope is a better predictor of first-year college performance than the SAT, ACT, or high school GPA. The final comment that I'll make is that a recent study by Gallup looked at the hope levels of the youth in schools and then compared those schools. And one of the findings they had was that schools where youth had higher hope scores had lower chronic absenteeism and lower suspension rates. So the power of hope is very clear in the science. What I'd like for us to do is take just a moment and consider the experience of hope. And what I'd like for each of you to do is to think about, especially for those of you who have driven a stick shift car or a manual transmission vehicle. And I'd like for us to think about the first time that you ever did that. For those of you who don't drive a manual, if you've tried to drive one, I'd like for you to remember that time. And then ultimately, if you have never tried, I'd ask you to imagine what it would be like to travel. And this is kind of an important point that I would tell you that in nurturing hope, we have to understand that imagination is the instrument of hope. We have to be able to imagine what the future would look like. So in this exercise, what I'd like for us to do is take just a second and reflect back on that very first time we drove that stick shift car. And just remember for a few seconds what it was like and the anxiety that you had. And so let's imagine that we have the car started. By the way, our valued goal is that we want to drive. And the only pathway that's available to us is a manual transmission vehicle or stick shift car. So let's imagine that we have the vehicle started. We've got the clutch depressed and we're in first gear. So as we're letting the clutch out for the very first time, and you can do this in the chat area, but as we're doing this for the very first time, letting that clutch out, what is your goal? And oftentimes the response is not to kill the car, not to stall the car. Some folks will say to move forward, but I'd like to focus on those of us who thought about our goal being not to stall the car. And what I'd highlight is that that's an avoidance goal. And so the reason I want us to think about that is that in all of our lives, each of us set both avoidance and achievement goals. It's just that lower hope individuals tend to be more focused on avoidance. So let's say that we stalled the car and killed it on that first time. So think for a moment what your self-talk was. What was going through your mind when you killed the car or stalled the car? And so for some of us, it may have been things like, I'll never be able to do this. I can't do this. One of the things we've learned from high trauma youth is it can become very self-destructive in the self-talk, like I'm a loser, I'm so stupid. Now, in our particular scenario, what I want us to think about is why we didn't quit at this stage. And this is an important takeaway in thinking about hope. And that is the more that we desire the goal, the more that we desire the outcome, the more likely we are to face adversity to overcome those challenges. So we start the car again, we're still in first gear, we let the clutch out, and this time we actually lurch forward, we're driving. So the third time we start the car and let the clutch out, we kill it, we stall the car again. But here it's important to recognize that our self-talk is starting to change, and it's changing from I can't to I've done this before. And this is another important takeaway in nurturing hope, and that is the idea that hope begets hope. So every opportunity for success builds my capacity and my ability to imagine achieving the future goal. And so pretty soon I'm driving. Now, the question in all of this is, how well can you manage your willpower? And so what I want us to recognize is how much of our willpower is required the first time we let the clutch out. And of course, it required all of our willpower. Now, remember, our willpower is finite. There's only so much to give. Whereas today, for instance, when you drive, it doesn't require that much attention. But I want us to think about this application in our programs. When we ask youth to try a new pathway for the very first time, we're making the assumption that they can dedicate a great amount of willpower to those first attempts. The problem is that the rest of life is also going on. They have other priorities in their life that are also demanding their attention. And then ultimately what we've learned is that unmitigated trauma is not an attention detractor, it's an attention robber. So that's the experience of hope. So I'll take just a second and ask you to put this in the chat, but I want you to think about what is the opposite of hope. And oftentimes what I hear is that the opposite of hope is despair. And what I would tell you as a nurturing professor at the University of Oklahoma is that you're wrong. The opposite of hope is apathy. And apathy, or hopelessness, is the idea that the outcome has already been decided and there's nothing I can do to change it. So why try? So no matter how hard I study, no matter working with a tutor, no matter what I do, I'm going to fail the exam. So why try? Now, despair is still a part of hope. In this case, we actually desire the outcome. We're still focused on the goal. We just don't have the pathways to that. And so when individuals are experiencing despair, that is that their pathways are blocked, they start to engage in desperate behavior. So imagine some desperate behaviors that might occur in the school or in the classroom, like cheating on an exam, for instance. So thinking about the Healthy Youth Survey, for instance, some of the things that we've looked at is reports of depression. And here we compare the different groups of youth, no or low hope youth, slightly hopeful, moderately hopeful, and high hope. And what we see is that higher hope youth have lower reports of depression compared to the no or low hope youth. Similar findings with suicidal ideation, that is, no or lower hope youth are reporting higher levels of suicide ideation. And we just finished another analysis, and what we found is that the connection or the association between depression and suicide attempts, as reported in the Healthy Youth Survey, were mitigated by hope scores. That is, if youth had higher levels of hope, there was no connection between depression and the attempt of suicide. So in this particular case, we're demonstrating that hope is a coping resource or a buffer to these at-risk youth. Similar with regards to risk behaviors, higher hope youth are less likely to engage in drinking or binge drinking. So the blue bars represent no drinking, and as you can see at the higher hope end, hopeful youth are more likely to not engage in these risk behaviors. Similar finding for smoking, hopeful youth are less likely to engage in risk behaviors. And this is coming, again, from your Healthy Youth Survey. As I mentioned earlier, the importance of thinking about hope as a thought process is because we know how to nurture hope. We actually know how to build hope in youth and adults and families. And ultimately, then, the idea is that hope can be taught. We know how to do this process. And for the last 3 years, we've been testing intervention programs and curriculum to see if we can move the needle from no or low hope to slight or moderate and even high hope individuals. And so the process is something that we understand. So as an example of that, I'll show you some data that we have from some high trauma children who participated in a week-long adventure-based camp that the curriculum all week is based upon hope, which is the goal setting, the pathways development. And these are the prevalence of the ACE scores or ACE categories of this youth. Average ACE score is a 4.4 for this population of youth. By the way, this is data from 23 states of a study that I'm leading on the research. And we measure hope 30 days before the camp, the last day of camp, and a 30-day follow-up. Now, one of the things I'll highlight is that this is not a therapeutic camp. This is a challenge by choice camp where a child wakes up every day, sets a goal, and then the curriculum and interaction all day is about pathways development and sustaining willpower. And so you can see that we find a statistically significant increase in these youth hope scores. Now, what I'll point out is our research and others have demonstrated that a 2-point increase in a child's hope scores, and I'll say that again, a 2-point increase in their scores predicts a letter grade change in the classroom. And that's what we found with this group of youth. So the power of hope is quite clear. We know how to do this process. We know how to nurture hope and the strategies that take place. What I will highlight is that we are currently in a pilot evaluation at Enid Public Schools here in Oklahoma. We are building trauma-informed and hope-centered schools. Every principal, teacher, counselor, and leadership at the school has a role to play in creating a culture of hope for youth. And one of the things that we're really focused on is for each of the schools, we're piloting this in 3 schools, 2 elementary and 1 middle school. And each school identified 8 what we call hope navigators. And these hope navigators have been doing a deeper dive training with me. We're at 24 contact hours. And the hope navigators will become the local experts in each of the schools. And the idea is we are building a toolkit for principals, a toolkit for counselors, and a toolkit for teachers on how to create a culture of hope. And the navigator's role will be to guide each school in that process. So I'm really excited about what we're finding. And just as one of the things we did was a baseline assessment of all of the staff at the schools. And I will tell you that what we found is that the link between stress and burnout among teachers disappeared in the presence of hope. So when teachers have higher levels of hope, the relationship between stress and burnout disappear.
Thank you, Chan. That was awesome.
Do the 3 pilot schools accept visitors? Do you know anything about that?
They will. Actually, our state superintendent has actually asked, and the school certainly agreed. They are creating a brief documentary video of what we're doing that we will also make available. And I can certainly put contact individuals that you can reach out to. In particular, the point of contact is Polly Maxwell from Enid Public Schools. I'll ask you to Google or go to Enid Public Schools website to get her contact information. We have the 3 principals from each school. And then the principals actually identified who the Hope Navigators would be. So they've already been receiving some contact, actually received one last week from Northern Ireland.
When will the toolkit be available for other schools, or is it school specific?
No, my goal in Enid, this is the beauty of working with the school, is we are creating a toolkit that we will make available. And so while Enid Public Schools will integrate it district-wide, they've also agreed to let me have it and to be able to disperse that to other schools as well. We expect to have the first draft of the toolkit done hopefully by the summer. We just finished the first semester of the training. So next semester, we'll actually roll it out to all of the schools and begin working with teachers and counselors on how to create curriculum, may be too strong a word, but initiatives. And by the way, this includes pre-K as well.
Thank you. One more question. Do you have suggestions for readings or exercises that we can do in the classroom prior to your initiatives being available?
Sure. So in terms of resources, and I think there's going to be a couple of slides, the book that Casey Gwen and I wrote has a little bit of information and some workbooks that will expose, and we've used these with both youth and adults. It's a goal setting worksheet as well as a what I call a hope worksheet. And I believe, Bonnie, did I make that available to you
Yes,
all?
and
Yeah,
it-
so that'll be available to everybody. You can actually Google hope and education and you'll find some information from Gallup. And I would also welcome if anybody wants to reach out to me individually. I'd be happy to share anything that I have or to direct you to resources.
So that does lead us into our next slide, and it is resources. Hope Rising, How the Science of Hope Can Change Your Life by Gwen and Hellman. Making Hope Happen, Lopez. We did link the Hope worksheet and the directions on our website. There's an explanation of the Hope scale. And then we also have a link to the Science of Hope poster. Chan provided us with the links to a couple of videos as well that you can watch. Making Hope Happen by Shane Lopez and Introduction to Hope by Chan Hellman. And they will be on our website. And I think that Kepi put them in the chat as well. Our contact information, again, my name is Bonnie Zimmerman, and we were joined by Emily Maughan and Chan Hellman. Their email addresses are right on our link, except where otherwise noted. This work was by the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and is licensed under Creative Commons. And many of our images came from the Noun Project. Here's some discussion topics for our chat.
One of the things that I'll highlight is that the worksheets that we have is really about introducing you to the process of nurturing hope in terms of the goal setting, the pathways development, and willpower initiatives. And so I do believe these would transfer over to online students. I've actually published a couple of pieces looking at online students and their ability and actually comparing at the university level first and second generation students. So these processes actually can be integrated into an online interactive environment as well.
Did have another question
about social emotional learning.
Yes.
So we're actually looking at, we're collecting data right now with a fairly large school district here in Tulsa, actually, where we're looking at some SEL indicators and also measuring hope. We see pretty strong positive association between child's hope scores and social emotional indicators. Preliminary, what we're finding is that hope tends to be a better predictor of academic achievement. And it kind of ties with the literature and the argument in psychology that hope is a Velcro concept, and that if you can focus and move the needle on hope, these other indicators will move along with it. And what I would actually argue is that if you think about the various indicators of social and emotional indicators, that the concept of hope is actually fairly clear as a concept and fairly simple. So that would be my preliminary response.
Someone saw a textbook recently called The Psychology of Happiness, as best as they can recall the title. And
Okay.
Does the study of this sort approach the idea of hope?
It does not. The happiness researchers, and it just depends on who the author was, Diener and some others. And what we tend to look at is things like happiness and well-being as outcomes of hope. The literature from the happiness studies basically demonstrates that among 24 known character strengths in psychology, which is where a lot of this happiness research takes place, that hope ends up being the better and stronger predictor of well-being. The conclusion from the 2000 published studies that I mentioned earlier is that hope is the single best predictor of well-being. And the thing that I like about it is really its simplicity. Again, it's about setting goals, finding viable pathways, engaging in problem solving, and then working on willpower. Some of the strategies that we're looking at is, for instance, with youth, pairing high hope children with lower hope children to work on projects so that we start to see some hope modeling. I think you have to be really careful about that just to ensure a good connection, a good authentic connection. But there are different strategies that can be used to help model hope for youth. If you can do the goal setting worksheet, that might be either one. I can.
Okay, Bonnie's going to pull it up.
I'll answer a question. Diane answered, if I was to purchase one book on the subject, what would it be? The Hope Rising book that Casey and I wrote tends to be a little bit more focused on how to, as well as tying the science. It is not an academic book. It was written for the general population to be able to utilize. And it incorporates these worksheets, including the scales that are there. Shane Lopez's book is a good book. It's a good introduction book. I think both would serve you well. I will highlight that Casey and I, all of the proceeds that are earned from our book actually go to support Camp Hope. So the proceeds actually are used to send children to Camp Hope for free. And you have one there in Washington, Olympia.
I did not know that.
Yeah, the Family Support Center of South Sound actually has a Camp Hope there in Thurston County. So you could certainly reach out there. I don't think they're restricted to Thurston County. So this is the Hope Scale. Is that what you want me to talk about, or the worksheets?
I can pull up worksheets.
Let me just make a quick comment about the Children's Hope Scale.
Mm-hmm.
It is validated for children ages 7 to 17. And I will be happy to send you the Spanish translation of those for both the children and adult. This is the Hope worksheet. So go ahead and scroll down to it. I prefer that people use the goal setting worksheet first because it actually sets the stage for the first 4 questions, which is about goal setting. And interspersed in these, I believe there's 11 items that you're asked to kind of work through. It's pretty heavy on willpower work. So for instance, item 4 is imagine you've just achieved your goal, describe how you will feel. And what we're trying to do is reinforce that goal attainment is something that they're highly motivated for. Maybe scroll down to show 5, 6, and 7. And so 5, 6, and 7 is really focused at trying to identify and prioritize pathways. So for instance, it may be that if my goal is to have a reasonable income, my pathways might include getting a job right out of school, going to, in Oklahoma, we call them career techs or VOTECs, or a pathway might be going to college. And so after you identify those, we invite you to start thinking about barriers so that you can begin to prioritize those pathways. Scroll down just a little bit more. One of the things that we do in item 7 above, when we ask you to think about the barriers, what we know is that tends to deplete the willpower. So we kind of interrupt that for a moment and ask the child to begin to think about a time when they've achieved something very difficult. So it kind of reminds them that they can do this. And basically, item 9 is a process called stepping. So what we do is we set and we identify the goal, and then we begin to list all of the sub-goals or the benchmarks that must be achieved in order to ultimately lead to the goal. It's called stepping. And what we've learned is that high trauma children really struggle with this, really thinking about how they're going to get there from here. So let me give you one example that may be relevant. If I'm working with let's say a 5th grade child, and he says that his goal is to be an NBA basketball star, I would actually be completely comfortable with that. And so I would start out there on the right side, NBA star, and then I would start working backwards. Okay, in order to be an NBA star, what do I have to achieve? I have to get drafted. In order to get drafted, what do I have to do? Benchmark 3. Where ultimately, as I step back, what I'm trying to do is show that child that being in school is a pathway to the goals that they desire.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a stepping process, and it's pretty important in nurturing hope.
Good information.
I went to one of your workshops, and actually walking through this process definitely made me feel more hopeful about my life goals and things that I've always wanted to do that I just have never gotten around to. And, just realizing I'm getting in my own way and I can do it if I just step it out. Stepping it out actually is super helpful.
Yeah, it's a very important part called stepping. When you work with a young child, say like a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or anybody really, you can actually do a thing that Shane Lopez introduces, and it's called nexting. So it's the idea of child saying, well, I would like to do this, like I would like to go to the store. And so what you do is you say, oh, okay. And then what would happen next? And it starts to show them the links, right? So they can start preparing themselves for being able to do that stepping process. So that's kind of one strategy to begin nurturing pathways thinking.
I think what you were saying before about like students who are kind of in that trauma space are only thinking 24 to 48 hours
Right.
ahead. They
Right.
might just not have the life experience to know that you have to get drafted to become a professional basketball
Right.
player. And so
Right.
that kind of pathway stuff is like, I don't, like you kind of have to study the people that you want to become so that you know how they actually
Exactly.
got there.
Well, and here, this is probably a great point to highlight the importance of mentors, whether it's peer mentors or adult mentors who can help them. They build those good, authentic relationships. Things that we found very consistently is that social connectedness is just a significant piece of nurturing hope. I've always believed that hope is a social gift.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking around.
Thank you all. Thank you so
Thank
much for the
you.
work that you do.